nobody warned center court. That's the thing nobody talks about when they replay the highlights. Nobody issued a memo, nobody flagged it in the draw preview, nobody sat down in a production meeting and said, pay attention to this one. The cameras were pointed where they always get pointed, at the names everyone already knew, the faces that had already won this thing before, the players whose rankings justified the broadcast time. And then, quietly, in the way that history always seems to prefer, something happened that none of those cameras were fully ready for. A 21-year-old walked onto the most famous tennis court on the planet. Half the stadium couldn't pronounce her name. The other half had already written her out of their bracket by Tuesday. And 10 days later, that same stadium was on its feet, flags waving that nobody remembered packing, grown men checking their phones at 3 in the morning halfway across the world just to watch a highlight clip on repeat because sleep felt like a waste of time when something this rare was happening in real time. What unfolded across those 2 weeks wasn't just a tennis story. It was the kind of story that makes you genuinely believe, if only for a few hours, that sport can still produce moments that feel completely unrepeatable. And here's what you need to know before we go any further. If you think the twist here is the upset win, you're looking in the wrong direction. Because the real story isn't the match she won, it's the one she lost. And what she showed the entire sport in losing it. But we'll get there. First, let's go back to where this actually started. 8 days before that silence fell over center court, Alexandra Eala was nobody's pick for anything. Not in a dismissive way, not cruelly, just realistically, the way tennis forecasters talk about the business end of a major. You get through the first week by surviving, the names that matter show up in week 2, everyone else gets a polite mention in the round 1 recap and then fades quietly back into the rankings. That was the script written for her. She just never agreed to follow it. She grew up in the Philippines on courts that weren't always regulation size, sometimes shared with other sports entirely, in a country where raw tennis talent has always existed in ways the infrastructure never quite managed to keep pace with. She came through the Rafael Nadal Academy in Spain, one of the most rigorous development programs in the sport, and she'd been quietly building a professional record that people outside the tour weren't paying much attention to. Her ranking had her seated low enough that most previews mentioned her name once and moved on. Walking into Wimbledon 2025, she was 21 years old, ranked inside the top 30, but nowhere near the names dominating the conversation. The grass at the All England Club is unforgiving in a specific way. It exposes footwork problems faster than any other surface, punishes hesitation, and rewards the kind of low, flat ball striking that takes years to develop properly on courts that barely anyone in her country grows up practicing on. Nobody knew what nerves like that would do to a player like her. Nobody knew because nobody had really been paying attention yet. Then they found out. Her first real test of the tournament wasn't some lower-ranked warm-up. It was Aryna Sabalenka, defending champion, world number 1, a player who doesn't simply beat opponents, she dismantles them systematically, like she's running through a checklist. Her serve alone is a problem that most players never solve. Her ground strokes are built for exactly this kind of moment. High stakes, big court, cameras everywhere. She'd won this before. She knew how to close these matches without drama. For a set and a half, it looked exactly like that script was playing out again on schedule. And then, somewhere in the middle of that second set, something shifted so quietly that the commentators almost missed calling it in real time. Watch the footage back and look at Eala's eyes during that stretch. They never leave the baseline. Not once up at the crowd, not once rattled by the name on the other side of the net, not once doing the thing younger players tend to do when pressure builds, searching for reassurance somewhere outside themselves. She just stayed in it, point by point, holding her own gaze. Her ground strokes got longer. Her footwork got earlier. Nothing theatrical about any of it, nothing that screamed momentum shift if you weren't watching closely, just a quiet, relentless accumulation of points until the wall she was supposed to run straight into simply wasn't there anymore. Final point of the match. Sabalenka's return sails long. And for one full second, nothing happens. No sound, no movement, thousands of people forgetting how to breathe at exactly the same moment. Then the noise arrives, and it doesn't stop, because a player nobody had circled on their bracket just walked off center court having beaten the defending champion. And everyone in that building understood instantly that they'd just watched something they'd be telling people about for a long time. By sunrise in Manila, this wasn't a tennis score anymore. It was every front page in the country. Office workers were setting alarms 2 hours early to catch replays before their shifts. Students had exams that morning. Didn't matter. The clips were already racking up millions of views before she'd even finished her post-match interview. A country that has produced brilliant tennis talent for decades, but never quite had a moment like this one, suddenly had one, and the noise it made was enormous. Here's where the story should have ended, and the reason it didn't is the part that actually matters. One enormous upset win, a beautiful headline, a name people hadn't known a week ago trending on every platform simultaneously, and then, quietly, the fairy tale reasserts gravity the way fairy tales in sport almost always do. Round 4 comes around, the draw does what draws tend to do to good stories. It serves up somebody who knows exactly how to stop them. Waiting for her was Jasmine Paolini, Wimbledon finalist 2 years earlier, a player whose game is specifically built for the demands of this surface, flat, fast, efficient, comfortable under pressure in a way that only comes from having already been here before and survived. The kind of player who doesn't need the crowd, doesn't need the moment to feel special, just needs the ball and the court and the rhythm she's already found. But there was something else sitting underneath this matchup, something that doesn't show up in the seedings or the surface statistics, but tends to matter enormously in sport when it finally gets unearthed. Back in February, on a hard court in Dubai, Eala had beaten Paolini. Not survived her, not scraped through in 3 sets, dominated her. It was the kind of result that players carry quietly for months, the kind that sits in the back of your mind during training sessions, during other matches, during the exact moments when you're supposed to be thinking about something else entirely. Paolini had carried that loss for 5 months, through a run that had taken her all the way to the later stages of Roland Garros, through the transition onto grass, through everything. And now, the draw had put them on the same court again. Same player, different surface, biggest stage of the year. This stopped being a nice underdog story the moment that pairing was confirmed. It became something sharper than that. Unfinished business with an audience of millions. Center court was already loud before a single ball had been struck. That specific kind of loud, not the polite, building applause of a crowd settling in for a match they expect to be good. The loud of people who had already decided they were about to witness something historic and couldn't contain what that belief felt like in their chests. Flags had appeared in the stands that hadn't existed in that building a week earlier. Supporters who had flown in on almost no notice, carrying something that was impossible to manufacture. The genuine, almost disbelieving joy of watching your country represented at this level for the first time. Paolini didn't look at the crowd once, not a glance. That told you everything you needed to know about where her head was. First game of the match, Eala's serve kicks wide. Paolini barely gets a racket on it. The roar that follows sounds like championship point. Way too early, way too loud. And for a few minutes, it genuinely feels like the story is just going to keep writing itself the same way it has all tournament long. Then it doesn't. 2 games later, Eala nets a forehand she could make blindfolded on a routine Tuesday. Paolini holds. then holds again. And somewhere in that stretch, without anyone being able to identify the precise moment it happened, this stopped being a coronation and became an actual fight. The raw, uncomfortable kind where momentum keeps switching hands faster than the scoreboard can reflect it. Eala was winning the crowd. Paolini was winning the games. That gap between adoration and actual scoreboard pressure is exactly where matches like this one get decided, and both players knew it. 30 all in a crucial game, a rally stretching past 10 shots, neither player conceding an inch. Then a return from Eala clips the line and dies before Paolini can reach it. Break point. She steps in, invites the big second serve, and when it comes, she absolutely buries the return. Break. For a moment, it looks exactly like another chapter in the same fearless story. It isn't, because Paolini doesn't blink. Not against this player, not after Dubai. She breaks straight back, calm in a way that almost looks bored, the specific composure that only comes from having already survived pressure of this exact size on courts of this exact importance. Even the commentators go quiet for a second. That silence that means everyone in the building is quietly recalculating what kind of match they're watching. Rallies stretch longer now. 12 shots, 15, neither woman willing to be the first to admit fatigue is becoming a factor. And then, in a service game that should have been routine, Eala misses her spot by 2 inches on a ball she'd normally track down without thinking. Paolini doesn't miss hers. Break. A second one. Eala smiles anyway, nods at herself more than at her coaching box, the look of someone who has no intention of treating a set deficit as anything other than a temporary condition. Paolini closes the first set 6-4 with a composure that makes the entire chaotic stretch before it look almost effortless, even though nothing about it had been. At the changeover, Eala sat and stared at her racket strings. If you watch that clip back, there's a specific quality to the stillness, not panic, not deflation, something quieter and more interesting than either of those things. The look of someone having a very precise, very private conversation with themselves about exactly what the next hour requires. Here's the detail almost nobody watching that match remembered in that moment. Earlier in the same tournament, in a match that had been almost entirely overshadowed by the Sabalenka headline, Eala had already come back from a set down, quietly, without the same cameras and the same coverage and the same volume. Her coaching box had seen it happen. They knew what she was capable of when the pressure shifted direction. That's why, even as the scoreboard made a strong argument for concern, not one of them looked panicked. She walked back onto court for the second set like a different player. Not reckless, freer. There's a distinction there that matters enormously in tennis. Reckless players start going for too much on the wrong balls. Free players start trusting the right instincts at the right moments. She began stepping inside the baseline on Paolini's second serve, stealing time before Paolini could use it against her, taking away the angles that had worked so efficiently in the first set. The crowd rebuilt itself carefully, excited but almost afraid to believe too quickly, leaning forward anyway because it couldn't help itself. She held to love. The entire rhythm of the match reset in one service game. Deep into Paolini's next service game, 3 consecutive returns landed deeper than anything Eala had attempted in the entire first set. The third one, flat, low, absolutely blistering down the middle, caught Paolini before she'd even finished her split step. Deuce. Deuce again. A let cord bounced Eala's way. Pure luck. The kind that either cracks a match wide open or gets wasted entirely, depending on what happens in the next 3 seconds. No hesitation. She stepped in and hit the cross-court forehand clean. Break. The noise that followed wasn't celebration. It was something else. Relief. A building exhaling all at once. A completely different sound from anything that had come before it in that match. Serving to consolidate, she dropped to 15-30, exactly the kind of moment where a comeback slips quietly through your fingers before you realize it's happening. It didn't slip. 2 clean first serves, a forehand winner that landed like punctuation. Hold. Paolini dug in, traded holds, refused to make any of this simple, but something had permanently shifted in the match's weight, and both players felt it. Lighter footwork from Eala, quicker to every ball, absolutely certain this set wasn't getting away from her a second time. Set point on her own serve. Wide delivery. Short reply. Clean forehand rocketed into open court. Third set. Match level. Somewhere in the stands, a flag went up so high, the person holding it nearly lost their footing. Down in a cluster near the baseline end, a group of Filipino supporters who had flown in on almost no notice were filming with hands shaking too badly to hold the camera steady. And that should have been the turning point. That should have been the moment where the story finished writing itself the way every single person in that building wanted it to. Tennis doesn't care what you want. It never has. The deciding set felt different from everything that had come before it. Heavier, tighter, every single point carrying a weight that the first two sets simply hadn't asked of either player. The crowd felt it too. Quieter between points now, more careful with its energy, as if everyone in the building had collectively decided that noise might somehow disturb whatever fragile thing was happening on that court. Here's the detail that genuinely matters, and that almost nobody mentioned enough at the time. Paolini had already lived through a deciding set on this exact court. In her own run to the Wimbledon final 2 years earlier, she had faced match-defining pressure on center court and come out the other side of it. She knew the specific weight of a third set on this surface, in this building, with cameras pointed at every micro-expression. Eala hadn't. Not at this level, not with this much attached to every single shot. She kept swinging the same fearless way that had taken down a Grand Slam champion just days earlier. But Paolini started reading the patterns a half step earlier now, anticipating the cross-court forehand before it had even left the strings, positioning differently, taking away the ball Eala had trusted all match. Small adjustment, enormous consequence. Midway through the set, in a service game that stretched across what felt like its own separate chapter, Paolini finally got the break she had been hunting since the first point of the match. 2 extraordinary retrievals kept the game alive against all logic, and then a backhand clipped the tape and dropped on the wrong side of the net. Break. Center court didn't turn against her. It went quiet instead. That specific, unmistakable quiet of thousands of people silently willing one player to find something extra, from somewhere, from anywhere, because they weren't ready for this to be over. For a few games, it looked like she might actually answer it. She saved break points with first serves that had no business landing, but did. She chased down balls that should have been clean winners and somehow dragged them back into play. She was still smiling between points, still nodding at herself, still not done, or at least not showing any outward evidence of being done. Serving at 3-4, she faced the hardest stretch of the entire 2.5 hours. Deuce. Deuce again, a rally that stretched past 15 shots, both players refusing to be the first one to acknowledge they had anything left to lose. And then, a backhand sailed just long on breakpoint. The break arrived, and with it, the unmistakable sense that this had reached its final chapter. Paolini served for the match at 5-3. Eala attacked every single return, refused to give away one free point, fought for every inch as if the scoreboard hadn't already made its feelings clear. But Paolini had done this before, on this court, against this exact kind of pressure. And she closed it the way only players who have actually reached a Wimbledon final understand how to close a match like this. One clean serve, one final forehand, and then it was over. 6-4, 4-6, 3-3. 2.5 hours, the most gripping tennis the tournament had produced to that point, and it was done. Here's what almost nobody expected from what happened next. She didn't collapse, didn't cry, didn't stand at the net with the expression of someone trying to understand what just went wrong. She walked straight forward, shook hands, and then shared a warm, completely genuine embrace with the woman who had just ended her tournament. Not the stiff, obligatory hug of two competitors fulfilling a social requirement, something that looked, from a distance, like actual mutual respect between two players who had just been through something real together. And then the entire stadium rose. Not for a champion lifting a trophy, not for a player who had just secured a place in the next round, for a 21-year-old who had spent 2 weeks completely rewriting what people believed was even possible for her, and who was leaving the court having fallen short of what she'd tried for, but having done it in a way that somehow made the crowd love her more than a comfortable victory would have. She left London as the first player from the Philippines to ever reach the 4th round of Wimbledon, a record that hadn't existed 2 weeks earlier, one that now carries her name on it permanently, regardless of everything that comes after. The clips were already spreading before she'd reached the tunnel. Not just the Sabalenka upset, the footage of her fighting back to level the match against Paolini, of her smiling through the 3rd set when she was staring down a result that was clearly becoming inevitable, because somewhere in the middle of that 2nd week, this had stopped being a sports story in the way most sports stories work. This was something else, the rare, almost inexplicable convergence of talent and timing and national belief and individual character that produces moments people genuinely struggle to explain years later. Paolini walked off having answered the one result that quietly bothered her all season, and she'd need every bit of that composure again almost immediately. A quarterfinal place meant another dangerous opponent, another full house, another chance for somebody else's story to try ending hers the exact same way she'd just ended this one. That's the brutal arithmetic of professional tennis. No time to enjoy a win, no time to mourn a loss. The draw keeps moving whether you're ready or not. Eala's coach didn't say much afterward, just stood near the tunnel with his arms crossed, watching her walk off court the way coaches watch players they've invested years in. Quietly, measuring something that doesn't show up in any statistic. She picked up her bag, took one last look around center court. The applause still hadn't stopped. Results fade fast in professional tennis. That's not cynicism, it's just the honest reality of a sport that generates new narratives every single week. Players who produce one extraordinary week and then disappear back into the rankings are far more common than the ones who back it up. The sport has seen it happen so many times that people have stopped fully committing to underdog stories until there's a second chapter to confirm the first one wasn't a fluke. But some results are different, not because of the scoreline, not because of the round, but because of what they actually measured. This one didn't measure a ranking or a bracket position, it measured belief. Hers first, and then an entire country's, built match by match across 2 weeks that nobody saw coming and that nobody who watched them properly will forget particularly quickly. It measured what happens when someone refuses to accept the story that's been written for her and just quietly rewrites it herself in front of cameras that were barely ready, on courts that weren't built for her background, against opponents with every reason to expect this to be easier than it turned out to be. She walked down that tunnel, out of the light, out of the noise. Behind her, center court was already resetting itself for whatever came next, the way tournaments always do, with the specific, almost clinical efficiency of an institution that has been doing this for over a century and has learned not to dwell. Except this time, something was different. Because everyone in that building now knew a name they hadn't known 2 weeks earlier. And if you were paying attention to any of this, you already know they're not going to stop watching for it. The scoreboard says she lost. Watch those 2.5 hours again and you'll see something else entirely.